Good morning. We've gone through an extraordinary period of amazing progress in automation, robotics, and AI systems in the last probably 5 or so years. And in many respects, thanks to a lot of the innovations and breakthrough progress that some of the people you've seen here on stage, like Kai Fu and Fei Li, who you'll see later, have made, as well as some of the robotics superstars who are actually in the audience. Ken Goldberg is here who works on robotics. Rodney Brooks is here. So we've made an enormous amount of progress. And I think much of that progress has come from systems-level innovations, particularly with regards to robotics. But when it comes to AI, it's mostly because of largely 3 things. We've made progress in techniques like deep learning, reinforcement learning, et cetera, more than I ever imagined. I did my PhD in AI and robotics about 20 years ago, and we never imagined we'd make that kind of progress. But we made progress at the algorithmic level. We've also had enormous amounts of compute capacity thrown at the problem, whether we're talking about compute capacity at the silicon level, whether it's the use of GPUs and now TPUs, and other silicon-level innovations we're going to see even more of, but also at the compute cluster level, where we're able to combine compute capacity in clusters in a way that helps us make enormous progress. But the third reason why we've made a lot of progress is because of the huge availability of data that we now have available to train the algorithms and so forth. In fact, as a rough rule of thumb, if you want to find where we've made progress in AI and machine learning, just follow the data, and we've probably made enormous progress there. So no surprise, machine vision, machine perception, classification problems of one sort or another have made enormous progress. So this is all very, very exciting, and I think we're going to see some more progress come through. But I think it's important to recognize that, and as some people have already pointed out, the benefits for businesses are actually enormous. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but I think the benefits are enormous. You've heard some of them articulated. There are also going to be benefits for the economy, at least in the sense that historically, and as anybody can imagine, automation systems have always made a big contribution to productivity growth, and productivity growth really matters for economic growth. For those of you who are economists will get that. And at a time when we need robust economic growth, both in the short term and in the long term, we're going to have to count a lot more on productivity growth, just given the aging population. So this actually will matter for the economy. So the discussion should not be about let's slow these technologies down. We actually need the benefits of these technologies from the point of view of driving economic growth. And they'll also be good for society in the sense that they're going to help us tackle some of the, call them moonshot challenges we've got, whether it's in healthcare or in climate science, or all these areas where we are unable to make the kind of progress we'd like to make without the use of these techniques. But I think the big question on everybody's mind is the question of, well, what about work? And that's the big vexing question we're all having to grapple with. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the work question. We've looked at something like over 2,000 activities. We've taken kind of a bottoms-up approach of the 2,000 activities that people do in the economy across something like 800 occupations. These are the occupations that are typically tracked by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And we've also looked at what's now technically feasible to automate on the basis of currently demonstrated technologies. And you get a picture, something like what you see on this chart. So those 2,000 activities, you can broadly put them into kind of 8 categories, if you like. And what you see, obviously, and this is an assessment of the technical potential and susceptibility to automation, is a way to think about what these bars represent. As you can see, there are kind of 3 groups of activities over to the right here, where the potential or susceptibility to automation is actually very, very high. Those are activities that involve mostly collecting data in one form or another, analyzing data in some form or another, usually in routine ways, and also doing predictable physical work in highly structured environments. So think about an assembly line or somewhere where you can set up the lighting, lay things out where you want them to be, and so forth. They have a much higher susceptibility to automation than the activities that look like they're more on the left of this. You could argue these are the ones that involve judgment or empathy or compassion and kind of the kinds of things that human beings do very well. So what's interesting about this is that the 3 categories of activities where the susceptibility is very, very high, they make up close to about 50% of the activities in the US economy today. Again, activities, not jobs, activities. These activities are pieces of all of our jobs in some form or fashion. And if you look at where's the density of these activities by sector, some sectors have a higher density of these activities than others. So the group at the top represents examples of sectors where the concentration of these more susceptible activities are in sectors like, yes, transportation and warehousing, retail trade, mostly at the checkout, but also you've got some sectors at the bottom where the density or proportion of these easily automatable activities is much lower. So you get a differentiated view by sector. What you can also do is you can go back and then map these activities back to occupation. So each dot on this chart represents an occupation. And the occupations that are higher up the vertical scale here represent occupations where the proportion of those easily automated activities is much higher. And the ones at the bottom have much less dense in that way. The horizontal axis just represents hourly wages. And as you can see, this isn't just a low-wage phenomenon, is one of the points on this chart. You've got as many activities that are high wage as there are relatively low wage. As an example, for example, you'll see that file clerks, for example, are much higher up on the scale versus, say, for example, landscaping grounds workers. That dot is actually down here. That represents the landscapers and grounds workers. And this also gets to the point, I think Kai-Fu made the point earlier, that this isn't just about blue-collar or manual laborers. And in fact, in many respects, they may be relatively safer, actually, partly because a lot of that work is happening in highly unstructured physical environments. And while we've made progress in robotics, any roboticist will tell you that one of the toughest things to build a machine that can actually function in highly unstructured and unpredictable environments. And much of the work down here, even though it may be physical, looks like that, whereas the ones up here look like they're more susceptible. And by the way, for fun, we kind of added where chief executives might be. But I think this gets at two key points come out of this activity level analysis. The first one is that if you then look at which occupations have the majority, call it more than 90% of their constituent activities that are easily automatable, it's actually a relatively small number as a percentage of occupations. It's about 10% of occupations have something like 90% today of their activities that are at the 90% level automatable. What you also see is the second point, which is that a much larger group of occupations, i.e. 60% of occupations, have about a third, 30% of their activities that are automatable. So this suggests that, in fact, more occupations will change than will disappear as we think about people working alongside machines. So the question is much more nuanced. It's both about, yes, some occupations potentially declining, but many more occupations changing, and many of our jobs changing as people work alongside machines. So of course, the question is, okay, so how quickly will all this happen, and how many jobs, and how broadly based will it be? Now, of course, it's almost impossible to predict this, and so we end up all doing scenarios. But there are several factors that seem to affect both the pace of this as well as the breadth of adoption. The first one is clearly the rate at which we're making technical progress on the automation front. Now, we've gone through a period where there's been huge progress in the last, call it 5, 8 years or so. But we've also had periods in the past where progress in AI has been relatively slow. In fact, there's a period that's often described as the AI winter, where nothing much seemed to be happening. And we could very easily hit one of those roadblocks or barriers somewhere. In fact, some people think that when it comes to solving general intelligence, we're still quite some ways off. But the question of technical progress clearly matters. And the assessments that I've just shown so far are based on currently demonstrated technologies. Who knows what the future will provide? A second important factor is just the cost of deploying these technologies. Because we know that simply demonstrating that something is possible isn't enough. I mean, we demonstrated that we could build electric cars a very long time ago. They didn't show up in cost-effective ways until very, very recently. A third important factor, and this is the one that will actually make the big difference, both if you look at different countries, different sectors and different occupations, are the labor market dynamics. So in other words, how large is the labor supply that can do that work? What wages are they paid? Is there enough of a motivation to substitute and deploy labor? That's why, for example, the outcome in, say, a country like India will look a lot different than, for example, the outcome in an advanced economy. And you can imagine what that looks like sector by sector, occupation by occupation. A fourth reason that's important to think about is benefits beyond labor substitution. If you think about it, this can go in different directions. There's some of these automation capabilities that actually go beyond simply replacing labor. We're actually getting something novel, something different, something actually better. And in many respects, we may see that the adoption in those categories will go much faster. And then, of course, what happens in terms of policy and also social acceptance matters a great deal. So when you take into account these different factors, you suddenly see that often these spectacularly large assessments of how quickly all this happens start to look a little slower. And many studies typically tend to just focus on just the first question and not work the way through. But I think the question still remains, which is, okay, will there be enough work for everybody? And what will those jobs look like? And I think you have to work through and accept that we're dealing with scenarios here as opposed to point estimates because of the factors I just described. But we've tried to build some scenarios to understand this. And we think there's two sides of the question. Clearly, there's scenarios you can build around the jobs lost, if you like, in terms of based on all the factors I just described. But equally so, you can look at what we call the jobs gained. In fact, a recent report that we published actually had this as the title, Jobs Lost, Jobs Gained, because we have to look at both sides of this. And I've already talked about the jobs lost, but talk about the jobs gained for a second. We know that historically, when economies grow, that tends to drive a dynamism that grows the economy and creates jobs. We also know that we can also look at factors that drive demand for work. And a third item to think about on the jobs gained side, we know that this 10% is interesting. If you look at kind of every decade for the last 40 or 50 years, something like 10% of the occupations in that decade didn't exist at all the decade before. These are new occupations we kind of make up and create as the economies evolve. So when you look at all the kind of the puts and takes, we actually largely, at least on this scenario, conclude that we think there'll be enough work for everybody. Now, of course, there are more extreme scenarios you can come up with, depending on the factors that I just described. That may change that. But this seems to depend a lot on a few things. Obviously, the pace of adoption, which we talked about, but also things like economic growth and business dynamism, as well as the growth in demand for work. And finally, the labor market dynamics, how fluid they are. And we know that labor markets have not been as dynamic and as fluid as they could be. So these are the factors that come in. Another important question is, okay, so what do the jobs look like? Well, at least we know, with some relative degree of clarity, the kinds of occupations that are likely to decline. And these are just examples, by the way. So we have a few that look like they'll decline because the automation potential is very, very high and susceptibility is high for the reasons I just described. But we also know that because of the difficulty of automation, as well as the demand for work and the way the economy is moving, there are some occupations that are likely to grow. So we're going to have an interesting kind of mixed shift here of occupations, some potentially declining and some potentially growing. And you can also ask, well, what does that mean for education and skills? And we know that of the occupations that are likely to decline versus ones that are likely to grow, the ones that are likely to grow are going to have potentially higher skill requirements, and the ones that are going to decline typically will have lower entry-level educational requirements in terms of, for example, people without degrees of any sort who haven't completed high school and so forth. But it's also important to notice that this isn't just about educational requirements. Even the actual on-the-job skills themselves are going to be quite different. And so as we think about this question, we know that there's going to be new skills, in many cases higher skills, but in many cases just different skills as opposed to what people have had. And we also know that we're going to need new skills to help people work alongside machines, given back to the point that many more jobs are going to change than will actually go away. And then the question of ongoing learning and adaptation is actually quite important, because people are going to work probably for much longer lives, when in fact their skills are going to be more shorter-lived, if you like. So that calls for probably more rapid and faster rates of education. But there's also a third important question which you should think about, which is, what does this mean for wages and incomes? And I think this, by this scenario at least, what you see here is that many of the middle wage jobs, what have been many of the middle wage jobs, we're going to see, if you like, wage declines in the middle of the income earning range. And that is largely a result of 2 or 3 things going on there. One is the mix shift. Many of the occupations, not all, but many of the ones that are declining today have slightly better wage structures than many of the ones that are growing. So think about care work, for example, and think about a whole bunch of those categories which are probably going to grow, but on today's wage structures don't quite pay as well as the ones that are declining. So the mix shift here will affect this picture. The other thing that affects this picture is, as people work alongside machines, and economists in the room will know where I'm going with this, which is there's this phenomenon called skill or unskilled bias technical change. And we know that when people work alongside machines, some of those are actually wonderful things, meaning the machine does what it does best. If the person is skilled and educated, the combination is wonderful. Their incomes and wages go up, and it's a happy outcome. But you could also have a different outcome, potentially, where the machine is doing all the hard work, the value-added work, and you've in fact potentially de-skilled what remains behind. So we have to think through these effects that have a potential for impacting the wage picture. So the question at the end of the day is, okay, so how do we get to a good outcome at a time when we obviously can't predict the answers here or predict exactly what will happen? It depends on so many variables. Well, at least there are several things that look like they would make a positive difference to how this works out. And I'm just going to list a few quickly here of some of the things we need to solve for. Clearly, a growing, vibrant economy that has lots of demand for work is a good thing. So getting back to somehow unlocking investment, we know that's one of the things that's holding back the growth of the economy, and reviving economic and productivity growth will actually positively impact this picture. So this isn't about holding back the technologies. We actually need the technologies to create some of the surpluses that will help us solve the challenges. A second point is, again, reviving business dynamism, because even if the economy is growing, unless you've got very dynamic business system and you've got a lot of job creation going on, this doesn't end very well. A third factor is that there's a significant need to step up investment in human capital for all the reasons we just talked about, the skill changes, the skill requirements, the education, the lifelong learning. The bar on that, on the need for that, is going to go up spectacularly. And this is particularly important at a time when, if you look at the data for both government spending but also private sector spending on the job training, which has been declining in most advanced economies, including the United States, for the last 30 years. So we're going to need to turn this around. It's an issue for both the government, policymakers, but also for the private sector. A fourth point is around improving the labor market dynamics. We know that the labor markets have not been as fluid as they could be, and we also know that we don't necessarily encourage more diverse forms of work. Example, the whole debate we're having about gig economy, when in fact those things offer different income earning possibilities for people. The hard one is how we rethink incomes. Because for all the effects so far, I think left to the market structures, the wage structures we have for the growing occupations, this might be a challenge. So how we think about benefits, how we think about safety nets, how we think about portability and dislocation support as people have to move from one occupation to another, these are going to be very, very tough challenges that we're going to need to think through. And then finally, we know that if we take on major investments that are good in their own right, they also have a positive effect on the jobs outcome here. So investments like infrastructure, climate change adaptation, or whatever one might think about those things, they have a positive effect on the work demand and jobs picture here. So these are some of the things that I think we're going to need to grapple with and think about. And with that, I actually leave that to the next panel with, that's going to tackle some of these policy implications. Thank you very much.